I promise that today's episode is going to be somewhat of a masterclass on personal brandings by one of the coolest people that I've ever seen speak or met. Chris, I want to thank you for being here today and also being cool to go live with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Chris.
Yeah, man. So let me introduce you to the audience, because for those that don't know you and have been following me, Chris is an Emmy Award winning designer. He hosts a podcast, The Future, with Chris Do. He's the founder of Future and the CEO and chief strategist at Blink. He's an author of an amazing book called Pocket Full of Dough. What such a cool name, by the way. And he has 2 decades of experience in design and branding. He's transformed visual identities of global brands, and rightfully so, one of the most sought after speakers in at international conferences. And he's been on a mission to empower creatives with the knowledge and the tools of success. And he's really done this with all of his platforms. So if you haven't followed Chris Do, follow him right now. Like, just stop this, go and find him on Instagram and make sure that you're following, because he has an amazing I really love what you're doing on LinkedIn as well. So he has amazing platforms across the board. Chris, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to do this today, man. It means a lot to me.
Oh, my pleasure. It's a Friday, so it's a good day to do content, I think.
That's awesome. That's when I do it. I usually do these always on Fridays because it's like the easiest day of the week. But I've seen you now. It's probably been like 3 times where you've spoken at either a mastermind that I was in or at an event. And for someone who says that they're an introvert, this last time that you spoke at the Ford event just a couple of days ago, from the moment you walked out on stage, you transformed. Your energy was just infectious. You were funny. You were witty. Your outfit was absolute fire, and the content was just powerful. Like, we walk around afterwards like, who'd you like the best? Who'd you like the best? And everyone was like, Do just crushed it. So you're a master on stage, man. And, so the timing for me is perfect, because everything that we talked about is super fresh on the mind. But, what changed? I'm just so curious about it, just starting off, like, what changed in your presentation? Because I don't know if it was a room or what, but you had an energy level that was just insane this time around.
First of all, I really genuinely appreciate you saying that. It affirms some of the things that I've been working on in my life, doing a lot of self-development work. But I think there's a couple of key factors here. As an introvert, as one who's like, and I say this, I know people are like, what? Are you sure? I'm really super socially awkward. If you met me at the party afterwards, like, yeah, he's not pretending. He is freaking awkward as hell. And it's because I don't feel invited. I don't feel like I belong. And it's something that I've been fighting for all of my life. And I imagine by the time I'm like ready to die, I've probably am still working on it. And familiarity with people, with venue, and with the event organizer, in this case, Neil, makes me feel more I'm coming to speak to a bunch of friends versus a bunch of people I don't know, strangers. Like, real estate people are not my people per se, traditionally. Mortgage brokers, loan officers, that's a whole different group. Y'all are a little bit different. You know what I mean? I'm used to speaking to these shy, introverted designers who don't make eye contact with you versus people coming across from the hallway. Chris, so nice to see you. And it's giving me a hug. I'm like, whoa. And I feel that. And I carry that with me. And I'm giving myself permission to lean into who I am. What you're seeing on stage is how I would normally behave in small groups of people that I really know, like, and trust. And so I said to myself, you know what? I want to make this fun for you guys. I've seen other presenters, and sometimes it feels like they're just speaking at you and not having a conversation with you. And my secret sauce, my jam, the thing that I think I do better than most designers who speak is I like to work with the audience, and I like to have fun with them. We can have fun with each other. You can make fun of me. I can make fun of you. So what people don't know is Trevor and I are brainstorming, or we're colluding in the back, like, how do you want to rip me on stage so that it sets the room, it sets the tone and intention for the room. So of course Trevor is like, what's up with your seatbelt here? I'm like, go with that, just rip me open with that, and then I know how to come back with you. So he goes, okay, are you cool with that? I'm 100% cool. And so it began there, just conspiring in the background.
Well, that's really, it's thoughtful, it's premeditated, it makes sense, and it really put our guards down to be like this is because, and it's funny because Trevor was sitting right in front of me, so I'm
Yes.
watching Trevor to see, is it's hurting his feelings, is he, is he in a good place, is Trevor okay? And he would turn around and he kept looking at me like, dude, I've never seen Chris like go this hard, like it was good. And we were both like, yeah, it was amazing, so thank you. But I will add on to this because you said something that, along the lines of you feel very awkward in a situation. So I pretty much, for every speaker at these events, I try to make it my point to get to know them and get to meet them. And obviously, if they're interesting and make sense for the audience, I want to try to bring them to the podcast. I've stayed away from you.
Mm.
I actually I really appreciate your podcast. It's one of the best podcasts that I've ever listened to. And as I was listening to it one day, I was thinking, to myself, I really am curious how he prepares for his podcast, because he's so insightful and so thoughtful with his questions, and it's in just everything. So I was curious about that. So I think I messaged you and asked you to be on, and, we went back and forth for a little bit and finally was able to get you here. But I saw you and I was like, I didn't feel like you wanted people to come to you and give you, and I see you do it with everybody, so don't get me wrong, but for some reason there was an energy that I was sensing, and maybe it was in my own head, but I was like, I don't want to bother him with this,
Mm.
because he seems to want to be by himself at times. And so, but then I'm like, but he's doing it with everybody else. So
Right.
for what it's worth, I do sense that sometimes. I roll by myself to a lot of events, and it is hard to get out of your comfort zone to go meet people. So I feel you on that.
Mm.
Before, Chris, and this might be a little bit of a segue into the next conversation, but before we get into the personal branding stuff, I wanted to jump right into what this podcast is about. We call it Breakthrough, and the way that I think about this is the water boils at 212 degrees, and that's usually the breakthrough moment. But at 211, just before it boils, there's something that happens to us as humans right before we're about to break through. And the breakthrough isn't about the flex on, I broke through and I'm successful. It's more about the idea that I had to change my mindset. I was in a hole that I needed to figure out how to get out of. And, when I look at you and I look at your success and look at everything that you've accomplished, in some point in that path, there was a hole that or your back was against a wall moment. And I'm wondering if you would be vulnerable enough to share that with us, and, what you had to go through to get out of that, to find that breakthrough moment and the success that you've earned so far.
I think one of the gifts that I have as an introvert is I spend a lot more time thinking than I do speaking, at least for the first half of my career. And I can recall very clear moments in my life, my timeline, where I felt my back was against the wall. It was a make it or break it moment. So I'm just running through them, looking for the one that might be most relevant to you. From a business point of view, the biggest breakthrough moment for me was when I learned how to when I stopped hating pitching and learned how to sell. And it was a very different thing. At this point, I had just hired my business coach. I'm about 5 years into business. Our company's doing somewhere north of $2 million in revenue a year, which is really good for a graphic design firm making animated titles and things like that. And I thought I had reached a certain level. I was winning work and a lot of work was coming to us. But there was this really strange thing. For whatever reason, when the budget floated north of 200,000, I could not close. And I was like, what is wrong? So at that point in time, I hired my business coach and I asked him, I don't know why, but I feel like there's a glass ceiling and I can't get through it. And he told me a couple of really insightful things I'm going to share with your audience. Number one is he said that I think you think you're in the major leagues, but you're a minor in the major leagues. When the budget goes north of 200,000, they can hire pretty much anyone in the United States and kind of anybody in the world. And so that means that the level of competition didn't just get incrementally better, it got exponentially better. And so he's like, you're a minor in the major leagues right now, and you think you're playing major league ball and you're not. I said, okay, my ego took a hit right there.
I was curious how you felt about that.
Yeah, so I know the results. The results was we're only closing about 20% of the budget, the projects that were north of 200 grand. Whereas if it was under 200 grand and it was a very real number, we know 190, I'm gonna close 85% of the time. Over 200 grand, it's like 20%, which is like 1 out of 5. And for us, used to winning, it was very demoralizing to the team. We put our heart and soul into the work, and then we would wait to hear with bated breath, are we going to get the gig or not? And like, well, they awarded it to someone else. And I would console myself by saying, at least we're invited to the party, right? Like we're going
Yeah.
kind of up against the biggest, most successful firms with a talent bench that's deeper than our entire team put together. Like their pitch team is bigger than our whole company. That's how big they were. So I was like, well, feel good that you were invited. But the competitive part of me is like, no, you're a loser. You've lost 80% of the jobs. Go after it. Let's figure this thing out. So what my business coach, his name is Keir McLaren. Keir said to me, talk me through how you do your pitches. And I was really proud, like, here we go. I'm going to tell you exactly how we do this. And he waited very patiently until I finished. And he goes, is that pretty much how it goes? I'm like, yeah. And then he asked me this question. How do you know based on that what the client wants? I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, you never asked them what they want. And I was kind of shocked by this. And I was thinking, you can't ask the client for what they want. You're supposed to know. I'm supposed to be this auteur. Like I'm supposed to use intuition, experience. I'm supposed to tell them what they want. He goes, no, kid, this is not how this game is played. Don't guess. And I thought it'd be crude or crass to just ask, what is it that you want? What inspired you? So he gave me something really big. And I'm a big believer in this now. All of us are capable of doing great things. We need to get permission from someone that we look up to, respect, and trust to allow us to do what it is that we were supposed to do. So Keir didn't revolutionize my thinking. He just gave me permission to ask the most basic questions. And 2 tries in, basically two sales calls later, we were closing 30%, 40%, 50%. And now in a very short period of time, like between 3 to 6 months, we're closing almost every single job of any size, that it made me kind of bored at jobs that were less than 500,000. That's how quickly it changed. And then what, right? It just shifted. That was the moment. And I could feel it. Like you can say like your life was going in one direction, something intervened and it split. The sacred timeline was split into 2 parts, and now we're living in the multiverse now. And this universe or this multiverse is much better and lucrative than the previous one. And then I taught my team, and I knew it was a repeatable, teachable skill, and that made me even more confident. So that was the moment.
It's such an interesting thing because I work in lending and I manage a group of loan officers and throughout the country that are out there meeting referral partners, let's say realtors. And they, every now and again, somebody will ask me like, well, what's the magic, thing that we offer as a company that I can tell all these realtors we have? What's the magic product? And I'm like, you can't. There's whatever magic product, you're the magic product. It's like, you have to understand how you can serve them. And so the question to them is, what is it that you need in your business that I might be able to help with? And together we might be able to achieve, because I can't help everybody and perhaps I can help you. And I think that's where we lose it, is I think a lot of people have pitched instead of sold. And I think that was the biggest thing for you. And when you did that, if I'm hearing you right, you went to like a huge conversion shift in over, 200, what was it, 200,000, 200 million?
No, 200,000 jobs are north of 200,000. Yeah. We are booking all the time now.
Yeah. So that's an amazing story. And I think that that's something that anybody who's in sales can relate to, is, understanding that if you show up and pitch, we say show up and throw up, then you're highly likely to, diminish your conversion opportunity. So thanks for sharing that.
My pleasure.
You said there were 3 things.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you said there were 3 things. What were the other things that he told you in that piece?
Well, he was saying that essentially when we don't ask, we assume, and you know what that means, make an ass out of you and me. And he just gave me permission to ask and to take the time that I needed to have that conversation. So later on, it evolved into like a system for selling. The first thing we would do is when we get on the call, we would ask them, we have this call scheduled for an hour, and we might take every minute of that. And we're going to ask you some questions that might be somewhat uncomfortable for you, but we don't want to build you what we think is good. We only want to do things that you are going to appreciate and find valuable. Is that okay? And they're like, okay. And then we will get into questions like, we can design lots of different solutions from 10,000 to 100,000 to $1 million and even more. We need to know how big the sandbox is. So we started to develop language that told the other person we're comfortable in talking about business and money. We're two adults here. I'm not trying to convince you of anything, and we're going to show up and we're going to ask you lots of questions, which led me to the ultimate conclusion, which is if you ask enough really good calibrated questions and you're fully present and you listen, you won't have to sell at all. Because what's happening, the subtext of all of this, what's happening beneath all the talking and listening is we're building rapport, we're aligning values, and we're sharing the same headspace. So their vision, even though it was unclear to them before the call, becomes very clear to both them and us. That allows us to say, the bullseye is very clear right now. We know how to hit it. And we're, instead of coming back with 10 different ideas, we're gonna come back with one, maybe two if we think there's a slightly different take on this.
That exchange back and forth, and the more you have it and the more opportunities you have for it, then you can determine if you just like each other, right? So that's the alignment with the values, and and you're giving them an opportunity instead of just showing up and only hearing dough. You're actually giving them an opportunity to get to know them and them get their voice. Everyone wants to be seen. Everyone wants to be heard. And so was it weird when you walked in there to shift your brain to say, this is no longer a pitch, this is an exploratory, because you got a room full of people that are probably expecting a presentation, and you turn that presentation into a series of questions. Was it hard for you? And did they even shift their energy to be like, whoa, wait, I wasn't expecting this? And how did that work on the first few tries?
It was a shift and it was awkward. And we keep telling ourselves, we're giving ourselves permission to take the space. If they're serious, we're serious. And this is how we know how to do things. And when you have that conviction, when you're convicted like the way we were, we know this is the right way to move forward. And yes, it was weird. People were exhausted after the call. They're like, I've never been asked so many questions, and you gave me such clarity. The ideas were great.
Yeah.
And this is an illusion. It's kind of like we're mentalists. We didn't give you any ideas. We just asked you what your ideas were and helped you focus them. And if there were two competing ideas, we asked you to resolve them and call them out when we saw them. And so each and every single time we're kind of removing things, or we're pruning things away to reveal what's left. And what's left is like, it's very clear to us now how to make this. And then we can take all of our energy and build that for you. And so we're not guessing so much anymore. And you're absolutely right. When you reach a certain level, they can hire any loan officer. They can have any mortgage broker in the world at a certain point. Well, what's going to separate you from the other person? What's going to differentiate you? And it's really about, do I want to work with you? Do I feel good about giving you my money? Do I trust you with looking out for my best interests? And that's really critical. So when they start to feel that, you automatically separate yourself from everyone else. And so I felt like it was one of these things where somebody asks, who wants $1 million? And then everyone else steps backward and you just stand there like, I guess it's me. I guess I volunteered for this because everyone else doesn't know how to build rapport, are constantly pitching ideas, guessing at everything. And they're thinking to themselves, I could see working with you for the next 5 to 7 weeks or whatever.
That it's really mind blowing to be able to have that superpower to now you've taken this pitch and changed it and you're converting, and it's bonkers. I mean, I'm pretty sure by now people in that industry who are doing the pitch has figured this out, but it really is a remarkable superpower that you figured out. And I think I love it. And when people figure it out, it changes their world. And which brings me to, why I wanted you to be on this podcast, because, several years ago, I want to say for me, it happened around the COVID timeframe when we all really leaned in, or there was a few of us that had leaned in really heavily to building a personal brand. And it was a really fun time. Not that COVID was a fun time,
right?
But the time where we were doing things that we had never done and we were exercising a part of our brain from a creativity perspective really brought on a different sense of the job. It was like, wait, this is actually fun. And I've always wanted to do this. And now I'm podcasting and we're going live and it's all this cool stuff. But, then I started hearing this personal branding piece floating around, and I didn't really understand the concept of it or why it mattered, because I had grown up always working under a company, and that company was the brand. And I was like a soldier of that brand. And there was a time where I didn't even want to follow anybody I was doing business with or engage with anybody that I was doing business with. So when COVID happened and we really leaned into it, then we started understanding personal brand. And I've heard so many speakers talk on this. And I think it's a lot because they're within my industry that they talk about. They all kind of sound the same and they all kind of have the same anecdotes. But then you come along and you started talking about style and you started talking about, this shadow version of yourself. And I'm going to butcher this, but the shadow version of yourself that gives you these superpowers to accept who you are and get above the shame and actually embrace your individuality, right? And so you came with these concepts that really, it wasn't like, it actually touched me in a way that I was like, it struck a chord in a way that I hadn't felt. And I was like, this is what's powerful. And I was like, whatever hour you gave me wasn't enough. I need to go deeper with you. And so if we're keeping it super simple, because I said a lot there, why is personal branding from your perspective important in industries like lending and real estate when most people are a lot of people in those spaces have really been in a word of mouth, client to client, B2B transaction? Why is this digitizing of their personal brand important now?
Well, I think we live in the social media age where we're going through, I think, what a lot of people call the creator economy or the attention economy. And we're seeing a lot of value there. So there have been billions, if not trillions, of dollars circulating around in advertising to get traction to sell products and services. And they need a place to share that information. I don't know when the last time you watched a TV commercial, maybe during a live sporting event or maybe a newscast. But outside of that, we're able to skip past commercials. I know it was a revolutionary idea when this product, the DVR, the digital video recorder that allowed you to slip time and skip past commercials like by TiVo. But now it's like the de facto standard is there are no commercials that you can't skip usually. And so advertisers are trying to figure out, well, how else do we communicate to people? And what happens to our company when consumers can talk to each other at scale? The power has been removed. So the companies or the corporations don't own the brand anymore. The people own the brand. So you can say you are X, Y, and Z. You have these values of honesty and good stewardship, but then you act in a way that's inconsistent with that. Well, you say something, but everyone who works with you says something else. And we know this right now. It used to be called cancel culture, but as soon as people find out, it spreads like wildfire. One of my friends and somebody who was an art center professor, he would say something like, do a good job, they tell one person. Do a bad job, and they tell 10. That's 100% true, right? It's like we are more likely to take action when we're pissed off, when we're angry, when we feel like we've not been served or taken advantage of, versus like, oh, I love Chris's service, so I'm going to go tell somebody. It's not. It doesn't usually work that way. I'm not going to write a positive review for the podcast. Very few people do that. But when you piss them off, they're angry and they take action and they mobilize. So if we take that concept of where are the new relationships happening, it's happening between all of us. So the people who can influence purchasing decisions, they're called influencers, so you can influence those decisions, are where people spend money with. So instead of going to a network, it's really a strange phenomenon now because, Chris, your podcast, you are the showrunner, you're the producer, you're the creative, you're the talent, you're the network, and you're the advertiser all rolled up in one. And it's an extremely amazing time to be alive, everybody, that you can have direct access to your audience. So when you show up 100% as yourself, not as the persona that we have to pretend to be to be liked and to be appreciated, well, there's going to be a coalition of folks who show up. It could be 1,000 people, it could be 10,000, 100,000, or 100 million. It really depends on the strength of your character and how you resonate and how relatable you are to everyone. This is important now because now you have a lot of power, and the power comes from you being you. And this is why I think so many people are investigating this, because it allows us to be different than everyone else who isn't doing anything. I said on the stage, and I've heard this from someone else, the idea is this: a product, service, or company that doesn't have a story is a commodity. So when we buy a toilet paper or toothpaste, if we don't understand what's different about it, we'll buy the cheapest version. But you know, I grew up using Aquafresh, and I don't know why, because I don't think it's great, but I have a connection to it versus Colgate or Aim or any one of these other toothpastes, right? So we all have a story. Like you have a favorite beer, probably, or a favorite brand of wine or water, or when you stay at a hotel chain, there's one that you prefer because there's a story that you developed. And this is why it's really important. So we, as individuals now, need to learn from what corporations have been doing for a really long time, but it's a little bit different. Here's the key difference, right? Many people who talk about building a personal brand are using it as a tool to market and sell products and services to people. They completely miss the point of having a personal brand. They're echoing what looks like advertising for corporations, and corporations have no personality. And my friend Yo Santosa says this all the time. People don't fall in love with corporations, they fall in love with personalities. So why are people trying to be like corporations? It makes no sense whatsoever. So my observation is, Chris, if you lean into yourself, if you stop trying to make a lot of different people happy and get their approval and their opinions, and if you just lean into who you are and say, you know what, I'm not really good for a lot of people, but I'm good for a certain type of person, you'll have more customers, you'll have more opportunities for book deals, for public speaking, for people who want to buy your product or service than you would have if you were trying to chase everyone.
I think the biggest shift that I made, Chris, and was I was trying to make content like every LO, right? Well, let me take that back. I was trying to make content like the Gary V's of the world at one point, right? You're just trying to take that blueprint and then but I always did when with the thought process that let me just get the mechanics down and get it out because nobody's doing it, and then there'll be a strategy that comes later, right? So then that strategy turned into, or somebody pulled me aside and was like, look, you'll grow your audience if you could do this content, but you make it so broad that it applies to, not just people in mortgage, people in real estate, people in sales. So then I started doing content that was like, I don't know, just investing content, how to, get a house with very little money. And I didn't feel good about it. I didn't, because that's not what I do every day. And even though that I do that, and I mean, even though that I have a team that does it, me personally, I'm not originating loans. I manage a, group of people that do loans. And so then I was like, well, I'm attracting the wrong people. Like if somebody DMs me and wants me to do a deal, I'm like, I just pass them on to somebody else because I don't do deals. But I was like, I really want to grow my network of people that I can help them do what I did. And that was, I was a branch manager who had a very successful branch, and it was probably one of the top in the country. And I know how to do that. I know the 10 steps, if you will, to get there. So let me try doing content around that. So when I look at a parking lot of cars, I'm thinking I want one car in that entire parking lot, but the person that works for me wants every car. And it's been really hard for me because I know that I'm in such a niche market that I put out content. I'm like, maybe one person is going to want to see it. And so that gets in my head. But I will tell you in a weird way, like I got an email yesterday from a guy that I've never met that said, I'm looking at I'm looking at shutting my company down and I want to come and work at your company. Let's get on a call. And I'm in my entire life of doing this, I've never had an entire team just reach out to me and say, we want to make a move and we want it to be with you. And the only reason they would do that is because of my content, right?
Right.
There's no other way for them to know me. But how do we get over that thought process of being in such a niche market that it's okay to do that?
Okay, there's a couple different things and a concept that I became aware of recently where it's not the number of fans that you have, it's the number of, or the value per fan. So if you have 1 million followers and they all give you $1, then that's the value. It's the dollar per fan. But if you have 1,000 followers and they give you $100, well, that's the value per fan, and that's what we need to really focus in on. And depending on what your ultimate goals are with building your personal brand and your content game, you really have to have a strategy as to what is it you want to ultimately accomplish. And all my designer friends, they're like, well, Chris, I only want to put out content where a client will see it and they'll hire me. I'm like, if you got that, you should bottle it and you should sell it and you'll be the richest person on earth, because it doesn't really work like
It
that.
doesn't work that way.
It
Yes.
doesn't work like that. I'm going to borrow an expression from my friend Blair Enns, and he says this: the market is bigger than your target. If you really focus in on the target, you actually attract all the adjacent people around it. And here's the example or the proof, just the way I've lived it, which is I make content mostly for creative people, like designers, people who build websites, who do motion graphics, who shoot video, who illustrate and draw logos. But there are people who work in plumbing and they lay tile work, or they work at airport security and they recognize me and they're like, dude, love your content. Thank you. Here's the story. We were staying at the Hilton, right? The resort world,
Yeah.
staying at the
Result.
Hilton. I needed to get a new card because my room, it wasn't working. I go up to the thing and he goes, sir, if I can just get your ID, I'll get you a new card. He goes, even though I know who you are. I'm like, okay. And he goes, I watch your content. Thank you very much. He says it kind of quietly under his breath. And it's a formality because they need to see ID. And then his coworker walks behind him and she says, I love everything you do for us. And
How
they,
amazing is that?
two people in the same hotel, in just a random encounter like this, will say that to me. And this is proof positive that if you make content that helps people to transform their lives, this transcends the sector that you're in. I speak from a place of expertise in the creative service industry, but it catches a lot more people. That's the whole idea behind the market is bigger than your target. Now, I will say this one thing, and I learned this from Brendan Kane. He wrote the book A Million Followers. He says basically, if you have niche content, you have to put a wrap around it. Okay. So if you think your niche content is like medicine and no one likes medicine, like it's a cough drop, it's a syrup or something, and it tastes gross. But if you put it around a soft gel capsule, everyone can eat it. Kids, grandmas,
Mhm.
everybody. And so you have to think of your niche content like that. The way that you do this is you hijack popular culture. You tap into what's topical, what's relevant, what people are talking about today: sports, entertainment, music. You could take your very niche content about running your brokerage, right, as a loan officer, and you could tie into the beef between Kendrick Lamar and who's the other guy? Drake.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like Kendrick or Drake, and you can talk about that, and you're like, and then you find a way to build a bridge. I didn't get to do it on stage, but at some point in the future for Forward, I will teach you guys how to build a bridge where you can take any piece of content and tie to what you want to talk about. And the more creative you are, the cooler that story becomes.
Yeah, I see people doing this all the time, and
Yes.
I feel like I'm not creative enough to do it, like the "Looking for a Man in Finance" song, and then they apply it to, to mortgages, right? Like,
Right.
and it's witty with what they're putting on the screen. And I'm like, I need somebody to copyright this or be a good copywriter for me. But I also think it's a muscle that you learn, or a language that you learn in
Yes.
in the creative space, right? If you don't have enough creativity juices flowing, or you're not around enough people who are writing content, um, then you're by yourself, and it's a very lonely place. I one of my hardest things is learning how to write the right headlines
Mm.
for content. And Neil is a genius with this. And we, so I pulled a mastermind together of people that I thought were really in the same space, or better than me. And then we all get together and we write content together. Like, we come up with an idea, and then we try to beat it down and with a good hook, and then we all go and produce that piece of content to see how it performs. But it really just gets us in a room to force us to just do content. And then we have, like, Neil will come in, or we'll have different individuals come in to share with us their ideas on our content. But it's truly a way for us to get together to flex that muscle that we don't get to use. So you're such a creative person. So how do you, Chris, help people with this? Like, you get on stage and you make it very interactive, but when you get into, like, I'm assuming you have like a course or a mastermind or something that I want you to share about, because there's somebody out there that needs your help. How do you help people develop their brand, their creativity, like tap into their style? Like, you hit so many aspects that most people don't hit into.
Yeah, so one of the exciting things that I get to do is I get to be in front of traditionally not creative people and share some of the tools that creative people get to live with all the time. And I love seeing their eyes light up. I can't quite see it, but I almost feel like when the light bulb moment happens, it brings me such joy. Things that creative people take for granted, quote unquote non-creative people,
Mm-hmm.
when they hear or see these ideas, their head explodes. And I can show you examples, like you break it down. My mind is very analytical despite being a creative person. But the difference is usually in that we are divergent thinkers, and most like left brainers are convergent thinkers, right? They have thinking that there's one solution, there's only one way. This word cannot mean anything else. So I'm going to give you some clues, okay? If we think about the elasticity of ideas, shape, and meaning, we can look in the realm of words in slam poetry and hip hop. If we look at how they play with words, the way it sounds, and on purpose mispronouncing things to create new meaning, we have what some writers call the smile in the mind. When we're in on the joke and we can see the bridge. I'll give you two very easy examples that I'm almost certain everybody here already knows about. When Jay-Z says, "I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman," you see, he just broke the two words apart, and we're like, bars, dropping bars, right?
Bars, yes.
And everyone can do this if you start to loosen up and forget the rules of English class and grammar and proper writing. And I think this is what's really interesting about certain cultures, because there's a lot more flexibility in how they can interpret things. A different person, Kanye West, he goes, "I'm aware I'm a wolf." And he talks about this, and he has a way of phrasing things. So he's saying he's a werewolf because he changes, but he's aware he's a wolf. And I think that's really brilliant,
Mind blowing. Yeah, it's
right?
like
We can see this with amazing copywriting, but it's not so pervasive in our culture. But you're listening most likely to some hip hop song, and there is a lyrical quality to how they come up with phrases and ideas. I think if you really lean in and you listen to the next track, whatever you're listening to, see how they structure words and ideas. They're not stuck in the way that we are. And so when we're able to see it, it's kind of like the matrix, the code you can see. That's not air you're breathing. That's not a steak you're eating. That is not wine you're drinking. You can see the code. So what I try to do is I help people to see the structure. And when you see the structure, it kind of, in a weird way, takes away some of the magic. Like I don't know anything about singing or playing music, but I have friends that are composers. They're like, "Oh, if you just knew the rules, this would seem almost formulaic to you." But because you can't see the rules, it looks like magic. And it's real interesting because I love watching how they do those magic tricks. And literally when you see how it's done, it's like, oh, it's not that special. It's actually pretty simple how they're able to do this, right? And so that's what I try to help people do, is break it down into simple pieces that when you put it all together, it's like you too can be an extremely creative person.
it's such a long road to do it, but you have to practice. I mean, you have to be into it. You have to be in the right mindset. Like I started reading books around this. I started trying to get, I listen to you religiously, listen to your podcast because I feel like it's there's different types of podcasts. So I'm listening to this podcast if I want to work on my mindset, but if I want to get creative ideas, I'm listening to your podcast. You give really you and your guests give really good anecdotes on how to be creative. And so I think if you could surround yourself, it really, starts to allow your brain, as you would say, to give you permission
Yes.
to get yourself into a creative space. Which brings me to like this next idea that you brought up is, we all I think when it comes to talking about ourselves, and I won't, I'll use me as an example. Like when I'm feeling about talking to myself, you immediately go into this mode of, well, who am I to say this, or there's something in our world. And Jamie at the event, I don't know if you got to see her talk, but she had a really good, she kind of the worthiness of yourself, which is also, disguised as imposter syndrome. And, it's like the one thing that holds people back. I think that's a lot of what happens. And you said it a little bit differently. You were talking about there's these things we're ashamed of in our life that could actually be our superpower. And why are we not bringing them to the forefront, or at least trying to figure out how we can creatively use them? But do you mind sharing your thought process on that concept, that idea?
Yeah, I'm going to add something new to this conversation because I've been having dinner with some friends, and they are exposed to such amazing coaches and mentors. And I hope I'm getting this name and the idea right. So I apologize in advance if I don't. Dr. John DeMartini, he's a therapist, and he has a very radical way of dealing with things. From what I understand, he says there's no such thing as a good thing or a bad thing. All good things have bad things in them, and all bad things have good things in them. So he helps people deal with extreme trauma, things that they're dealing with, like people who have been abused as children or in relationships, and he tries to help them to see it a different way. His basic philosophy is this, is that most of our energy is spent on holding on to the negative, that we make no room to see the positive. So if we take this into pop culture, and I'm a big fan of like really well written stories, fiction, and what it's doing is we're being entertained, but there's like this subconscious message that's being sent to you. But most people are kind of asleep and not able to understand the message. It's really powerful. One of my favorite examples is Game of Thrones, right? The series did not end well on TV, but whatever, we'll put that aside. And some spoiler alerts here. So if you don't want to hear this part, you probably want to skip this, okay? There's a character, his name is Brandon Stark, and he had witnessed something, an act between a brother and a sister, and he gets pushed out the window and becomes handicapped. He's paralyzed from the waist down. And because of that, it sets off a whole chain of events that then he ultimately becomes the three-eyed raven. He becomes this all-knowing being. He transcends and transforms from not being a human anymore to being above it all, kind of like in a godlike thing. But the people who wronged him felt tremendous guilt and shame for what they did, including the person who pushed him out the window. So Jamie, having transformed as a character, approaches Brendan and says, "Hey, I'm really sorry for what I did. It was a horrible thing." Because you don't need to be sorry, because I would not be who I am if those things didn't happen. I wouldn't have gone north of the wall. I wouldn't have met the three-eyed raven. I would not be who I am. So all these things had to happen. So Brandon is telling us humans, as we're watching the story, that if we can come to peace with all the transgressions against us, we can actually be grateful for who we become in the process. So children who have to deal with a lot of trauma and overcome adversity, they become really strong people. Not all of them, but the ones who do. So you can't hate the entire experience and appreciate who you are without understanding those two things are very interconnected. So enter Carl Jung and the shadow word, right? Your shadow self. Basically, there are parts to us that we feel such shame, guilt, anger, anxiety, frustration around that we don't know what to do with this. So we kind of suppress this part about ourselves. And we're so afraid that people will see this part of us that they'll no longer love us and we're not worthy of being loved. It's a horribly painful place. So then I take this and I say, well, now you're a fractured self. There's only parts and pieces of you that you're willing to like and show to the world. Well, that doesn't make a whole self. So we have to work on accepting the shadow parts of ourselves to become the integrated self. And when you do so, you become a whole human, not a human with a hole. There's a big difference there, right? So everyone who's needy, insecure, has imposter syndrome, has a hole in them that they're constantly trying to fill. And no amount of love and external energy can heal a hole that you yourself haven't patched up in the first place. So a lot of what I talk about in personal branding is let's find out who we are. Let's learn to love ourselves, to feel that we are worthy, because we will show up differently and we'll have a different frame to look at the world. And when we can do that, here's the weird part. We automatically draw people to us because we magnetize ourselves. And this is pretty much what has happened in my life in the last 10 years when I started to go on social and start to share content and be in touch with who I am, knowing that there are parts about me that people don't like and being 100% okay with that.
You said so much there. I got to break this down because so let's start with the Game of Thrones. One, yes. I remember this.
Yes.
Did not get that out of that, right? Like did not land with me. Even on the, like, just a story as you were talking about it, I was like, oh yeah, that did happen. That's right. That's how that, yes. And then you think about it in the subconscious, but I also love the idea of, the person with a hole versus being a whole person. And I think that is something that, as you were talking about it, it really speaks to me because I think we all walk around with this hole. And then the last thing I'll say is, Chris, I mean, I think why you touch people is because you're not staying in the creative side. You're really touching an emotion in people. And that's really what I see happening in the rooms that you go into is that I think you mentioned this one time that you've been in a, you'll get tears as you start to kind of go through creatives and building people's personal brands and getting them an idea to think about it, because in order to touch that level, you have to go really deep and into that emotional sense. But do you find yourself dealing with clients that you end up being somewhat of a therapist in that sense? And do you find yourself in that space a lot, working through that with clients?
Yeah, well, I currently don't have clients. I haven't had clients in a long time. I do mostly coaching and teaching. We'll call those people clients. So
Yeah.
I don't do service work anymore. But in your space, for example, I feel like everybody who provides a valuable service is in some form providing some kind of level of therapy. Somebody has a problem, and the problem is so great that they will spend money and seek help to solve that problem. And sometimes they're mental problems, sometimes they're financial problems, but that's really what you're trying to do. So when we were doing strict design, we would just describe it as design therapy or brand therapy,
Mhm.
because there's something that you feel is broken or missing, and we want to heal that part so you can move on with the rest of your life. So a lot of times, say, this is a dumb example, but let's say you have an identity system and a website that you think sucks, that doesn't reflect all of who you think you are, that feels beneath you, doesn't feel as aspirational as you see yourself. Ira Glass talked about this on a podcast episode. He's the host of This American Life, one of the biggest podcasts. He goes, there's this gap that exists between our taste level and our skill. And creative people feel this very deeply. And so we think we have great taste, but our ability to make what we envision in our head is so far apart that we have this horrible pain inside. So we don't do anything. So he plays for the audience an episode that he did, and it's horrible. And he goes, "This is me 5 years into my career. I should know what I'm doing at this point, and what a mess this was." And this is that gap that exists. And what we're trying to do is close that gap. So that's what I'm trying to help people do. So in therapy, there's the person that you'd like to be and the person you are, the aspirational self versus the how you feel about yourself. And here's the reality of it. How you feel about yourself is judged much harsher than how most people see you. So the gap feels even bigger. So if somebody's coming to you and says, I have a dream home. I know you're not a broker like that, but I have a dream home, and this is what it means to me emotionally to be able to buy that, because my mom, my dad, my cousin told me I would never make it, and I went against the wishes of the family, and I'm finally in a place where I think I can afford it, but I'm not certain. So buying the home is for them to exercise a demon, and it's not about the home, it's about what it means to them, the emotional story. So you have to very gently, not literally, but figuratively, put your arm around their shoulder. It says, I understand you. I know what this means to you. And I'm going to do everything in my power to make this a reality for you.
I
So
think so
no,
many people miss
yeah. So
that.
no one ever really just buys an iPhone. They buy an iPhone because it means they've made it. Their status there, because you can buy a cheaper phone, right? No one buys anything purely for what it is, but for what it makes them feel. It's a story that they tell themselves.
I totally agree. So in terms of when you're talking to these individuals that are walking around with these holes, and you're trying to fill them, and you're trying to get them to just come around and understand, like, hey, you're more than the shame that that half the people around you don't even see. How do you break through in that, like, in terms of when you see brand people in the personal branding space really embrace it and break through that other level? Do you have examples of you working with people who you've seen that work with?
So like I said before, Chris, I don't do client work. What I do is I teach and I give people tools and resources. I try to help as many people as I can. So I don't have any one person who's hired me is like, help me reinvent my personal brand.
Yeah.
I did run a mastermind for a period of time, but I found out, my gosh, it's so much energy to pour into such a small group of people.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's my life's work, right? But in those moments, what I would do is I would talk to each person, and I won't mention this person's name, keep their identity anonymous, but he said to me, Chris, I'm getting horrible reach and engagement on social. And I said, okay. And I asked him, what do you think the problem is? And he knew it right away. I didn't even have to probe too deep. He says, I think I'm showing up too perfect. Like I'm presenting a part of my life,
Mhm.
and I'm not being open enough. I said, see, so you actually create a barrier for people to get to know you. And he is not alone. I think the vast majority of people who are trying to go through this, creative, non creative alike, create a barrier to create distance between who they are and who they pretend to be online. And most of us can see this because we're not stupid, right? Our survival depends on our ability to read people quickly. Just by looking at a person's face, body language, the hair, what they wear, you're like, oh, I don't like this person, or I like them, I don't trust this person, or I can trust them. We're making 1,000 snap judgments, and we need to because otherwise it'd be so taxing on our brain. So when people create these facades and they say certain things because they think people will like me more if I say this, or they won't judge me so harshly if I don't talk about that. But by doing so, people will look at your content and say, they're hiding something. I
Mm.
can't put my finger on it, but they feel fake. I believe there are two sides to them, and the side they're not showing us, I'm worried about. So it's really strange. This is the kind of the paradox of this. The more you want to be liked by people and do what they want, the less likely are that they're going to like you. And the less you care about the opinions of what people want, the more likely that they'll care about you. It's really weird. And I got to say, and I don't have any factual data, but I'm going to just throw out a wild ass guess at you. I would say 95% of people who are posting content, your community, my community, are showing up in an inauthentic way.
Mhm.
Not consciously, maliciously, but they're doing it because that's all they know how to do. And I hope to change that.
I think you are. And so I'm going to go back to something real
Okay.
quickly. I think you are. I've seen it happen. So I'll give you two examples of people that I saw you really make an impact with. And so while you don't work with people one on one, but when you're in the room, Chris, and you connect with someone, and I've seen it happen. I've been in masterminds where you've done this. It turns into a one-on-one situation with them. There's a guy that I am most likely going to hire to help me with this podcast because you helped him and you talked about how his story as a videographer and how
Mm,
you changed, you really broke him down and you were like, hey, this is how do people know what you do?
right.
And all of a sudden he's showing up in my feed and all of a sudden
Yes.
it just started to happen. And then he started talking about how he's doing these podcasts and he's doing
Yes.
audits on them, and then all of a sudden I'm using him, and this wasn't a one-on-one client with you. This is somebody that you just happened to notice, and probably for whatever reason out of goodness of your heart gave them advice that they executed on and eventually have changed their life. And that's why I think your impact goes beyond, I mean, maybe what you see, but that's why I asked the question, because
Yeah.
I've seen it. Like, there was a guy that you really worked with, and he created this entire branding for his podcast and everything around something he was ashamed of in life, and
Mm,
I watched you do that. And so, when if anybody is ever it has an opportunity to, one, see you speak, make sure you're there, and two, if you could ever get in a mastermind where you're doing what you do, Chris, it is phenomenal. So I really appreciate you and what you're doing for the community, because it is strength in what you're building strength. And I think when you say I'm trying to change that narrative of, or not the narrative, but I'm trying to change how people show up for their branding.
yeah.
I get in front of this, and I was talking to my podcast, to the person that works with me on, he's my producer for the podcast, and I was telling him that sometimes I feel like when I get nervous, I'm yelling at, not yelling, or I'm talking at the person versus
Yep.
having a conversation with them.
Yes.
And he's like, I notice you do that. And I'm like, I'm trying really hard to like work on that. And it's a nervous thing, but I do that with my content. I'm no longer talking to an individual. I'm talking to an audience. And I think that hurts the
Mm,
content as well. But it
mm,
comes from a deep rooted, I want to be liked. I want to get my content across. And the more you do that, you're almost pushing people away. Whereas when you don't care, you start to invite them back. It's a really weird, counterintuitive.
yes. It is very much counterintuitive. And I'll give you some things I've noticed about people who seem to be able to relax and pull themselves back to who they are and be grounded in the moment. I had the pleasure of seeing Simon Sinek speak at a local auditorium, whatever. And Everybody's gathered there. He had just come off like Start With Why, and he's writing another book called Better Together or something like that. And I saw him. I was really observant because I want to study this man and how he's able to speak. And he stood there and he just went like this for a little while. Like he's washing his hands and there's no water, but he's just doing this. And I think the friction of his hand, the physicality of it is grounding him in the moment, and it's helping him not to get inside of his head where there's hundreds or 1,000 people sitting there waiting to hear what stories he has to share. And I think simple things like that will kind of reconnect you to who you are versus like, oh my God, I'm about to go live and the countdown is happening and there are hundreds or thousands of people who are going to tune in. And we get so freaked out by the fact that we imagine these things happening. And it's just like, you know what? I just want to have a conversation with you. And a buddy of mine says, what you want to do is you want to take a couple deep breaths and look out towards the horizon. Because we do not look out towards the horizon and look upwards if we don't feel safe.
We're right here.
We're right here. We're like, what is coming at me? Is there a tiger? Is there a rattlesnake? So we look out towards the horizon. This is what we do naturally, right? When there's a sunrise or sunset, we stare out, we're calm, we're in our breath, and we're doing a little bit of this. And the last thing that I'll share with you, just to help you ground yourself before you go live, is if you could think to yourself, I'm going to say a blessing for each person who tunes in today. In a non-religious way. Like, I just want to wish you well, friend. And when you can do that, I think it helps you just reconnect to who you really are. So you don't have to show up a little funky at the beginning.
And it's an awkward thing. And I really appreciate you sharing that with me. I usually feel like right around the hour of a podcast is where I'm comfortable and then they're comfortable and then you got to come up.
And then it's kind of over.
But Chris, I thank you for I know how busy you are, and you were really kind to share, your insights with myself and the audience especially. And so, and thank you for being cool with going live on this, but man, I'm a huge fan of yours. I love your energy. I love what you're doing to change how people do marketing and how they, show up. But thank you so much for being here today. It means a lot to me. And guys, for those of you that are watching and listening, please follow Chris Do on Instagram and LinkedIn and wherever else, TikTok, everywhere you could find him. He has an amazing YouTube channel as well. But if you want to get into the creative space, this is the one you have to be listening to. So Chris, man, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for sharing the stories and just edifying me. I thought my identity was a graphic designer, but I think my real true identity beneath that is as an educator. I love to teach. And so I am appreciative of Neil inviting me back on multiple occasions. He's like, we've invited you more than anybody else. And I want to pour into the community because it really recharges my battery to see that moment, whether it's Rich or someone else in the audience, when that moment happens. That's what teachers live for. That something we said, did, or showed, or provided to you actually created the kind of transformation that you've wanted, and you have your breakthrough moment.
That's it. Man, that's a cherry on top of everything. And that's the clip. I appreciate it, Chris. Thank you so much, man.
My pleasure.